Hello and welcome to Cyrus Forum. My name is Mariam Memarsadeghi. We are gathered on the first anniversary of the Woman Life Freedom movement in Iran, the brutal killing of Mahsa Amini. We are very honored to be joined today by world experts in democracy coming from varied perspectives and worldviews, but having spent a lot of time and thought on the revolution in Iran over the last year in particular. We're joined by Sharan Tabari, who is our one Iranian. She has, I will introduce each person, but has done a lot to prepare ground for the future of democracy in Iran. Carl Gershman, the former president of the National Endowment for Democracy, who really needs no introduction, provides a comparative perspective, a global view on this movement as compared to others. Zineb, Riboua, a Moroccan who has such a sharp lens on the entire region and has also been really focused on Iran in the last year in particular. Hillel Neuer, of course, from UN Watch, has done so much to promote Iranian dissidents and to pressure Iran's regime, particularly at the UN, where he was successful in leading the campaign to oust this regime from the Commission on the Status of Women and other UN bodies, which it is absurdly a part of. And Ivan Marovic, who is a world expert on nonviolent people power movements for democratic change. He's, of course, one of the leaders of the Otpor movement against Milosevic in Serbia. My name is Mariam Memarsadeghi. As I mentioned, I started Cyrus Forum just a few weeks before the killing of Mahsa Amini. Our focus is on building knowledge and capacity for a durable democracy in Iran, for a durable transition to democracy in Iran. But because this movement erupted just after we launched, we've devoted a lot of our discussions over the last year to what the movement needs, what its capacity is, what its strengths and weaknesses are, and in particular how the international community can step up to the plate to be supportive. Just after Mahsa Amini was killed, I think the day after, I was on a TV program, a Persian language one, and there weren't any protests yet. And I hadn't really spoken to anyone about the killing. And on the live program, I remember the first time it's ever happened to me, breaking down in tears as I provided condolences to the Iranian nation, to the people of Kurdistan, and to the family of Gina or Mahsa Amini. The feelings that I had that day turned out to be the feelings of many millions of Iranians throughout the country and throughout the diaspora. It was very much an emotional, cathartic reaction, something that had built up in people for the last 44 years. The brutality all of a sudden became unbearable in the form of one individual young woman. Since then, there have been over 4,000 protests in Iran, countless strikes in virtually every sector of the economy in every part of the country. The diaspora has mobilized in unimaginable ways in every major city, but also in small towns in countries throughout the world. There has been, however, at the same time, a very deep crackdown from the regime. Over 6,000 people have been killed for protesting. More than 20,000 have been imprisoned. Children have been systematically tortured, as documented by Amnesty International, and many thousands of schoolgirls have been poisoned throughout the country. On top of these real-world repressive techniques by Khamenei's regime, there has been a very adept cyber army mobilized as never before and likely aided by Russia. The regime itself admits to being supported in these ways by Russia, and the regime admits itself to heavily funding its cyber army. In fact, we have another panel at Cyrus Forum devoted specifically to the issue of the cyber army and how it has had new success against the democratic opposition in recent months. This part of the operation by the regime, the virtual component, has been very significant in my view because it has managed to make the opposition even more divided than ever, unfortunately. The people are very much united on the streets in the country and throughout the diaspora, but political elites are really steeped in vitriol and deep distrust. Recently, I met with Ivan Marovic, who's here with us today, and he said something that really stuck with me, as he always does. Ivan taught classes at Tavana, which I co-founded and co-directed for 10 years on nonviolent resistance. When I met with him a couple weeks ago, he said, unity needs to feel awkward. And so far, political elites in Iran's democratic opposition have resisted that awkwardness, unfortunately. Instead of a willingness to cross over and emphasize their mutual goal, there's been an obsessiveness, again, very much aided and propelled by the regime's cyber army about attributes, backgrounds, histories, cultural leanings, beliefs, old feuds, grudges. And so the regime has excelled in this way. The irony is that the gains politically have been enormous over the last few years, not just the last 1 year. Since 2017, the slogan "Islah talab usulgara dige tamum majara," reformists, hardliners, the game is over, shouted by the mustazafin, the historic base of the regime, is significant. Really turning against the totality of the regime and calling for regime change unmistakably. We're going to get into a number of questions, and there are some binaries or dualities that I think are very important that we'll probably come to again and again. One is the street versus the virtual realities, protests versus online organizing, values-based discourse and pragmatic, strategic considerations, decisions, economic drivers of political change, and discourse that is really just pure political, the diaspora versus the inside, and the religious base of the regime that is turning against it versus urban, modern, middle-class Iranians who arguably have always been against it. I'll just read the questions that the panelists were provided prior to our discussion today, and then we will begin with Sharan Tabari. Questions are, what are the most important gains of Iran's democracy movement over the last year? What are the most significant challenges or obstacles, threats, weaknesses, bottlenecks to be overcome? And what are your recommendations for overcoming them? How have global advocacy efforts helped to craft effective policies from international institutions and free nations toward Iran's democracy movement? But also, how is foreign policy by free nations still lacking or even counterproductive to the promotion of human rights and democracy in Iran? We'll begin with Sharan Tabari. I will introduce her. We are honored to have Ms. Tabari as a member of Cyrus Forum's advisory board. She was an elected member of the city of Westminster and served the city as councillor for 2 consecutive terms. She currently hosts a Persian language TV program called The Future of Iran, and was senior advisor to a project of the same name at the London-based think tank, the Legatum Institute, where she was also a fellow. She has been a journalist with the BBC and Radio Free Europe and a university lecturer in political science in Iran. Please begin.
Hello, and thank you for having me with your distinguished panel. And before starting, I want to say that my heart goes with the Iranian people, the families who lost their dear ones, and the ones who have their dear ones in prisons, in brutal Islamic Republic's prison. in 5 minutes is not a long time to answer all the issues that you raised, but I start by saying what I believe are the most significant gains of people in this last year, uprising or whatever you want to call it. We call it revolution. Some people say it's not a revolution yet, but I do believe it's a national revolution. But anyway, I would say that Islamic Republic has reigned Iran with terror from the inset, from the day one that they took power, by execution, incarceration, torturing, and you know the story. And they put fear in the heart of their citizens. Last year, after the death of Mahsa Amini, the young people, women and men supporting them, came to the streets, and with their courage and bravery, they returned that fear back to the heart of the Islamic regime. And we've been witnessed for a short while, although before they reacted brutally to the demonstrators and killed them in hundreds in the streets, we've witnessed that how much they were fearful of the power of the young people who came into the streets of Iran. And although they suppressed them brutally and savagely, the movement that they started, these young people, has not withered away and has not gone anywhere. It will have its ebbs and flows, and we will witness the coming up of it in the next few in the near future, in the next few days. That's one of the gains, that fear, that very paralyzing fear, has gone from the people in Iran. That, I think, is an extremely important achievement, because I lived in Iran myself at the very beginning of the revolution, and I experienced that fear that suppressed free speech, suppressed dissent, and suppressed every move by people who were held hostage by the Islamic Republic. The second thing, the second achievement, I think, is that again, just Islamic Republic, from the day one, they set their own red lines. The red lines were one by one, since the 1988 in Persian calendar, 2009, when there was a very substantial uprising, where is my vote, the Green movement, that those red lines started to be broken one by one. And last year, the last thing, which was hijab, that was eroded as well. So they said to Islamic Republic, no more red lines is accepted by Iranian people. You can't suppress us in that way by giving us your own way of perceiving the world. And the third achievement, in my view, is what this movement has made, the impact of this movement in the international community. The world has never seen such a bravery and courage of young people coming and standing up to a brutal regime that had no mercy on them and was prepared to shoot them on the street, to blind them, to torture them in their prison with the most savage ways, to drug them, to you name it, and then coming up and killing young children even, so that they're called the child killer government. This is one of the names that people are chanting them in the street, the child killers. And this has brought the attention of the whole global community, or the whole free world, in fact. And just before coming to this meeting, I was in another interview about the same issue, talking about what has been done since the past year. And at the same time, as I was towards the end of the interview, there was a discussion in European Parliament about this Iran, and what the European Parliament is asking their government to do. And what they said, which is very interesting, they one after one, they said that we spoke a lot, we talked a lot, we gave solidarity to Iranian people, but nothing has happened. Nothing has happened. Nothing substantial was done. I understand that every single one of you are trying so hard, like I do as well, to address the issues that goes on in Iran. I spoke in European Parliament myself for asking them to put the Revolutionary Code into sanction the Revolutionary Code, but nothing has happened. Mr. Borrell came out and said that we have our own obstacles for doing that, our own problems in doing that. Today in the Parliament, they were talking about that and they were asking for that to be done. I mean, the British Parliament unanimously asked for sanction. The European Parliament unanimously asked for sanction, but nothing happened. The governments have to do it, and nothing has happened. And I hope, I finish in a minute, Mariam John, and I hope that the year coming would be the year that the free world, the European community and American community get their acts together and ask for a real action against the Islamic Republic. Thank you.
Thank you. Beyond sanctions, what actions would you like to see? Seems to me that the biggest obstacle is an unwillingness by the world's leading democracies, chiefly the United States, to say that this is a regime that has to go and the people on the streets are demanding that it goes. And there isn't a recognition that the regime needs to go. Would you agree?
I absolutely agree. I think all these years, all these 44 years, including last year, the free world have tried to engage with Iran in order to contain it. The policy of containment is not working anymore. That has, as people of Iran have said, and you rightly mentioned, they were deceived for 30 years of these 44 years at least, that they're going to change, they're going to be reformed, there's going to be some opening. The things have gone worse and worse, from worse to worse, and nothing has happened. Its time has come, and this is what I've been saying to every place that I gave interviews to Iranian TV outlets, radio outlets, that the point at this stage is that the West have come to understand that they have to deal with their problems, deal with their dual prisoners in Iran, dual national prisoners in Iran, and come and go to Iran and say, come to the negotiation table and find an exit route for them. An exit strategy has not been devised since then. Once they do that, once they start talking to Iranian government, saying that it's over, it's not going to happen, nothing will happen. And then another dangerous thing is that they push Iran, and they have pushed Iran more and more towards Russia and China. I tell you one thing, which is very frightening. The MI5 in my second home in Britain has told the minister, the Secretary of State for Internal Affairs, that we have, that was a month ago, that they have found 15 terror plots by the Revolutionary Guard in London, in England. 15 plots of bombing and kidnapping people. Sorry, I'm just thinking Persian sometimes. Kidnapping people, because I gave so many interviews on that. And they demanded to do something, but the government is still putting it behind them. And I feel that they're all waiting for America to take the lead. Both Britain and Europe are waiting for that to happen. And the longer they wait, the more difficult it becomes. Iran has now started providing weapons for Russian. You all know better than me that Russia is short of cash and short of weaponry in their fight against Ukraine, and Iran is providing them with missiles, with drones, and not only that, they're building a base in Lebanon, just 20 kilometers to Israel's border, in order only to attack with their missiles. So it's time that the West understand that it's not only the Iranian people who suffer, the consequences will be on everybody.
Thank you so much. Okay, our next speaker is Hillel Neuer. I already mentioned that Hillel has been absolutely instrumental, particularly over the last year, in pushing back against the regime, kicking them out of the UN Commission on the Status of Women, that absurdity, and in general being a real linchpin for the international community to know that they can't just speak niceties and get away with it when it comes to this very brutal regime. Hillel Neuer is a Canadian-born international lawyer. He's a writer. He's executive director of UN Watch, a human rights NGO and UN watchdog group based in Geneva. He's founding chairman of the Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy, a coalition of 25 NGOs from around the world. He's written on law, politics, and international affairs for the International Herald Tribune, Juriste International, Commentary, The New Republic, Christian Science Monitor, and Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, I think among other places. Neuer was selected as one of the top 100 most influential Jewish people in the world by Israeli newspaper Marovic and by the Allgemeiner Journal in 2017. He's an outspoken defender of Israel and critic of the UN's Human Rights Council's actions. Hillel, thank you so much for being here. Please begin. You're muted.
How about now?
No, you're muted, Mariam.
Mariam, now you're muted.
Sorry, I was just asking Carl to mute himself if possible to avoid any extra noise. Go ahead, Hillel.
Okay, all right. So look, Mariam, thank you very much for inviting me to join this august panel on a vital topic and could not be more timely as we are about to mark 1 year since the death in police custody, hijab police custody of Gina Mahsa Amini. You know, you asked the panelists to describe some of the accomplishments of the pro-democracy movement for Iran. I'll name a few of those, list some of the accomplishments at the UN level, which is my specialty, and then also share with you where I see our challenges. So clearly the accomplishments that I see globally are awareness worldwide that we didn't have before on what's happening in Iran. Even Iranian-born lawmakers like Ali Reza Khondi from Sweden told me that he wasn't particularly active on the issue of Iran. He's an Iranian-born lawmaker in Sweden, and suddenly he became extremely active in taking a leadership role. So you have, whether it's Iranians and certainly non-Iranians, gaining awareness that we didn't have before. We also saw a dramatic shift that I witnessed, and I'm sure everyone else did too, that before last year's protests, there was a group, a camp in America, let's say, of apologists for the Iranian regime, that they were elevated. They were the go-to people for most of the leading media and other institutions, and other voices that were exposing the true face of this regime were deemed warmongers, and they were pushed to the sidelines. And we saw a dramatic shift. I don't know if it's sustained, that's a good question, but certainly in the initial several months, I witnessed a kind of Winston Churchill moment of thinking, 1940, where someone in the British Parliament who was saying for a decade, there's this evil guy named Hitler, and he's coming, and he's arming himself, and he's breaking agreements, and we have to stop him. And no one listened to him. And suddenly, 10 years later, when war came, it was almost inevitable that it kind of was inevitable that they turned to Winston Churchill. You were the one who called it all along. You need to lead us. And he did. And that's what I saw happening to so many clear voices who've been calling out the Iranian regime for what it was. If they were pushed to the side for years and accused in very nasty ways, suddenly they were invited by world leaders. You had Mahsa and Ladan Boromand invited to meet Macron in the Elysee, and other world leaders, and even some of them invited to a UN event, which is rather rare, and certainly to leading media. So that was a dramatic shift that was important to see. And finally, in terms of accomplishments, I will cite some of those at the UN level. We had, for the first time ever, we had an emergency session of the Human Rights Council on human rights in Iran. This is something that we had called for going back to 2009, so many years ago. We had invited Nazanin Afshinjam. She came with Ahmed Batabi, with 50 Iranian human rights defenders signed, and we appealed to the UN to have an emergency session, and this was ignored all the years. Suddenly, even though it was worthy to have happened years ago, for all the terrible things that happened years ago, suddenly they did call an emergency session. It was the German foreign minister. I give her credit for that. Maybe that was thanks to 100,000 people marching in Berlin. But Annalena Baerbock took initiative, and she flew to Geneva, where I'm speaking to now, across the street from the Human Rights Council. And we had something that we never saw before, an urgent session on human rights in Iran. Should have had many of those before. Suddenly we had one, and it passed with a strong majority, despite the very dubious membership of the Human Rights Council. When democratic human rights supporting countries take leadership, they can often bring many countries on board, and the naysayers might abstain or go quiet. So that was an important accomplishment. And they adopted a strong resolution, and it created a fact-finding mission. Again, the first investigation ever created here at the UN on Iran. And so far, the fact-finding mission has spoken once in an oral update in July, and they seem to be on track. It'll be many months before we get their final report, but these were accomplishments we never saw before. Urgent session, fact-finding mission created, and the other one that I'll mention that's noteworthy is the expulsion, as you had cited, Mariam, of the Iranian regime from the Women's Rights Commission, known as the Commission on the Status of Women. I'll just point out that 2 years prior to that, when the regime was elected to the CSW, we protested, and there were protests around the world, but the United States State Department wouldn't say anything, okay? They were extremely muted. When they were asked on the election, Joe Biden had just come into office. Clearly, they were trying to send an olive branch to the Iranian regime, and we see now that there's some kind of deal being made and billions have been released. So clearly at the time, they didn't want to say anything, and they were asked by Voice of America or someone else, and it was more or less no comment. It was like, yeah, sometimes bad countries get elected. What can you do? They didn't want to specifically comment. But 2 years later, not only did they comment, but Kamala Harris supported the removal of Iran from the same body, and the US was the one that initiated the process. And the first time ever, there is no procedure to remove a country from the CSW, but you can do it. If you elected a country, you can remove them. And America called a special meeting, and they removed them. And that was amazing. So, we were on a high. November, December, we were really on a high at the UN. Things were happening. Sadly, the momentum changed, the winds changed. And I'm just going to list a few things and wrap up. In the past several months, since May, we've witnessed Iran being rewarded by the UN for several plush roles. The whirlwind of UN wins for the Ayatollahs is astonishing. First, the regime won election in New York in May as vice president of the UN General Assembly, one of several vice presidents that are elected. In the words of Chris Liu, the US ambassador on UN reform, quote, Iran cannot act as an honest broker in its role as vice president of the General Assembly because it has shown time and again that it does not seek to enhance global peace and security, but rather works against it. Indeed, only 6 months prior, the same body, the UN General Assembly, in December of 2022, condemned Iran, one of only a handful of countries that get subjected to UN General Assembly resolutions, in a long resolution, about 5 pages long, enumerating numerous abuses. Iran was condemned by the General Assembly. Fast forward 6 months later, the same body chooses Iran to be vice president. Makes no sense. Second, Iran at the same time won election as rapporteur of the General Assembly's Committee on Disarmament and International Security. This means Iran's representative will likely present some 70 draft resolutions this year on issues such as nuclear proliferation, threats to international security, and terrorism, even as this regime is the perpetrator and the menace of the very problems that these measures are meant to address. Iran's ongoing breaches of nuclear agreements contradict the very essence of the Disarmament Committee's mandate. The assignment threatens to legitimize the regime's ongoing violations and frankly discredits the UN's commitment to disarmament. Again, makes no sense. Finally, the most confounding appointment of all is in May, the Iranian regime was appointed to be chair of the UN Human Rights Council's Social Forum. This will take place on November 2nd here in Geneva. Keep in mind again, the Human Rights Council, as I said in November, condemned Iran for its violent crackdown on peaceful protests, created its first ever fact-finding mission on Iran to investigate abuses, particularly those against women and children. On May 9th, 19 of the Human Rights Council's experts, including the experts on torture, summary executions, involuntary disappearances, strongly condemned the regime for its recent executions, targeting government critics, which they said was tantamount to arbitrary deprivation of life under international law. So that's May 9th. May 10th, the president of the Human Rights Council, the Czech ambassador Václav Balek, announces the appointment of Iran as chair of the Human Rights Council Social Forum. So, you know, Eleanor Roosevelt, who championed the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose 75th anniversary we're now celebrating, must today be rolling in her grave on seeing these appointments. Again, makes no sense. We are emboldening the torturers and terrorists of Tehran with undue recognition instead of holding them to account. The UN is betraying its founding principles. Why does it matter? I believe these appointments send the wrong message at the wrong time, enabling the Islamic Republic, even as it is shooting protesters in the face, raping human rights defenders in prison, it allows them to strut on the international stage as a respected and influential actor. Indeed, the regime is able to proclaim also at home victory to its people. So it demoralizes its people at home. Witness instant declarations of victory in state-controlled Fars News, IRNA, Press TV, in order to dishearten, dispirit, and demoralize dissidents. How did Iran win? What can be done? Sadly, inside the UN, too many delegations go along to get along in their closed world of backroom deals and geographic rotations. A bloody dictatorship is every inch the equal of a liberal democracy. So we have democracies paying lip service to the high principles of the UN Charter, but too often they ignore them when making critical decisions. So we have a petition of 90,000 signatories. We have the US government has spoken out against this appointment, 34 members of the European Parliament, but there's been no action. The Human Rights Council is meeting now for the next month. We've drafted a resolution. If they want to take action, the US, any European country can introduce this resolution to cancel the appointment. That's what has to happen. I'm convinced if it gets introduced, Tehran can be removed. And to conclude, it's time for UN member states to stop legitimizing murderous regimes in violation of the world body's founding principles and to begin holding perpetrators like the Iranian regime to account.
Okay, because you have had a lot of extra time, I'm just going to make a comment rather than ask a question. It's striking how similar your comments about the UN system and Sharan Tabari's comments are, in that there's all this knowledge, there's even votes from parliaments and members and speeches, but when it comes time for action, it seems that the regime's backroom deals are what hold the real power. And you know, there is, and the National Endowment for Democracy has done a lot of work on this. A lot of scholars of democracy have done work on this, that the consolidation of these resurgent authoritarians around the world, they have each other's backs. And so in the case of Iran, it's not just Russia and China, it's Venezuela, North Korea, African countries. There's a whole slew of them. So just in the interest of time, we'll move on to Ivan Marovic. Ivan is Executive Director of the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict, ICNC. ICNC, as many of you know, is a place that activists from around the world go to for resources and learning opportunities on nonviolent resistance, how to grow their movements, how to become more resilient and effective. Ivan was one of the leaders of Otpor, the student resistance movement that played an important role in the downfall of Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia. After the successful democratic transition in Serbia, Marovic began consulting with various pro-democracy groups worldwide and became one of the leading practitioners in the field of strategic nonviolent conflict. He is the author of The Path of Most Resistance, a step-by-step guide for planning nonviolent campaigns, published by ICNC in 2018, and it's available in many languages. I mentioned before, Ivan taught many classes at Tavana. Iranians know him well already. Ivan, please begin. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Mariam, and it's an honor to be here, and we are all inspired by the struggle of the Iranian people, and I myself always have something new to learn from what I observe in Iran. So let me share some of those learnings here with this panel and with the audience. So as you know, we at ICNC, at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, we are not just disseminating and sharing knowledge about civil resistance and movement building, but we also do a lot of research and trying to kind of see what are the things that are happening around the world and what are the new advances in the field. And for that, what is happening in Iran has been very important, and the contributions of the Iranian movement to the field have been recorded over the years and decades. So, for instance, if we look at the previous year and the protest movement in Iran that started a year ago, and compare it to the previous protest, what we can observe, even going back to the student movement in the late 1990s, what we can observe now is that the movement today in Iran is much more widespread, much more grassroots, much more diverse, and much more decentralized than it ever was. So even like looking at for instance, the Green movement only like a little bit more than a decade ago, when we compare it to that, it is much more broad-based and much more extra-institutional, meaning that it is happening throughout the country, in neighborhoods, in small towns, and including people, especially young people, who haven't taken part in movements before. What does that mean? That means that it is much more difficult to suppress. And I think when we look at the crackdown that has been happening since the movement started, that was organized by the regime, we can see that nervousness of the regime, that is afraid that this movement is much more decentralized, much more grassroots, that it is going to be much more difficult to suppress. So in a sense, when we look at the brutal tactics, beyond that brutality, what we can see is the nervousness and the lack of how shall I say, certainty of the regime. So what can we observe also? One of the things that we see is that this decentralized grassroots nature of the movement also we can contrast with the more reformist political currents that existed in the 90s that still looked at the path of changing the situation through the institutional framework. But now that has shifted, and that also means that when the change happens in Iran, it is going to be much more fundamental and much more, how shall I say, deep than any change that could have happened, for instance, like a decade ago or 2 decades ago. So in a sense, that is another reason for the regime to be nervous, because the path for them to kind of create some sort of a hybrid regime, maybe to reach some sort of accommodation, is slipping away. That is, how shall I say, what we observe compared to the comparing this movement to the previous waves. On the other hand, I think we should also talk about the potential challenges that come out of this nature of the decentralized nature and the grassroots nature of the movement. And the biggest challenge is to, especially if we talk about the fundamental and radical change that the movement actually, you can feel it in the air as the result of the movement. It also requires a clear path forward, like a clear platform of how this change, how this transition is going to take place. And this is probably like one of the biggest challenges that the movement will have to deal with in the future, because there are certain elements of the regime, and what has been reported in numerous media is that the supporters of the regime are less willing to confront the movement than they were only a few years ago during COVID, when crackdowns against protests were much more easily suppressed, and the regime supporters were much more willing to offer their hand. Now there is already, we can observe a lot of doubts and a lot of uncertainty within the cohort of regime supporters, especially in the outer layers. But for these people, for these supporters of the regime, to be able to fully defect, because these defections are actually at the core of transition, that clear path forward needs to be formulated. So in a sense, and just to end, and we're going to talk about this probably more, this kind of unity around the vision, unity around the alternative political and social arrangement is actually more important than anything else. So although the regime has repression as their only tool, and this is what they use because this is the way they are trying to scare people away, what they really hope for is this unity. What they really hope for is fractions emerging, bickering, and fights in the movement. They know that their repression alone cannot suppress the movement, because it can, if faced with unity, it can actually cause a sort of backlash. And in a sense, unity around the vision is where I see, how should I say, the challenge forward when we look at the future development of the movement.
I completely agree with you, and I think that it was clear in my opening remarks also that there's so many gains and really so many things to be proud of, and so many fortunate things that have happened. But the lack of unity at the top of the democratic opposition is the biggest weakness, and it's the biggest opportunity that needs to be seized. It's ironic, it's a paradox, because before the killing of Mahsa Amini, there were things like from the Prince Reza Pahlavi, Peyman Novin, a new accord to bring all different parts of the political spectrum together, or a campaign, No to the Islamic Republic, again, bringing all different kinds of actors together under one campaign umbrella, big tent. And those things, and it's really, you have to, I think, chalk it up to the success of the regime, and particularly its cyber army. Those things seem to be forgotten by political elites. And there is almost even, I think, a pride in exerting differences and fighting. And that's just a gift to the regime. So I was going to ask you, Ivan, how you think unity. How have you seen unity develop around a common vision in other movements? But maybe, if you don't mind, we can save that for when we're talking all together, because I think that's a question for everyone also. We're going to go to Zineb Riboua now. Zineb is a research associate and program manager of Hudson Institute's Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East. She specializes in China's involvement in the Middle East, North African affairs, and Israeli-Arab relations. Prior to joining Hudson, she was a research assistant at Center for Jewish Civilization of Georgetown University. And she worked there on Jewish identity in Morocco, Moroccan-Israeli relations, and the cultural impacts of the Abraham Accords. She has held research positions at Morocco's Ministry of Tourism, Ministry of Economy and Finance, and Bank Al Maghreb. Her pieces and commentary have been published in the Washington Examiner, American Conservative, The Hill, Jerusalem Post, Tablet Magazine, and other outlets. She is also an associate at the Association for Global Political Thought at Harvard, and she holds a master's in public policy from McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown and a certificate in international relations and politics from Magdalen College in Cambridge. She did her undergraduate studies in France, where she attended French preparatory classes and HEC Paris's Grande École program. She's a native of Morocco and speaks Arabic and French. Please begin, Zineb.
Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation, and it's been very refreshing to hear all of you and learn from you and learn from your experiences. As I worked on Middle East affairs, and I was following at the time Iran very closely because of the Iran nuclear deal and so on, and then I saw the revolution happening, and what I found interesting is that coming from Morocco and having friends in Egypt and all over the Middle East, it seemed that the biggest, I think the biggest takeaway is that the regime is not just a threat to the Iranians, but it's a threat to the whole region. I mean, for the fact that you will find people in Tunisia, in Libya, and across the region also chanting with these women, life, freedom, I just found it extremely important because there's always this focus from Europe and the United States, but now the focus needs to be also on the region itself, that freeing this generation, this young generation of Iranians means also freeing setting free the whole generation of Middle Easterners. Why? Because the regime has also tentacles all over the place. They infiltrate madrasas, they infiltrate universities, they make sure that their ideology is widespread. They try to diffuse their ideology through networks. They have these small groups, sometimes aided by Russia. Sometimes they find their own way of doing so through channels, etc. So I do think this was very interesting and important to watch. There is also something that someone mentioned, that this is really a movement, and there is going to be a transition, because I do see it as it's a failure for the Ayatollahs, I mean, ideologically speaking, that there is now a generation that hates them. I mean, they've spent so much money, so much resources. They've repressed so many people for so long, for decades. But now they lost a generation, doesn't agree with them, doesn't want to follow them. And I think this will be very important to watch, because it means that there is going to be a change. If not now, then maybe later. But it's a first. I think it's a first thing to keep in mind, that this was, you know, as I see it, is that the revolution exposed so many things, but there were also some myths about the Islamic Republic regime, that it will last, that it will become more democratic, but the revolution exposed that that it's not going to happen, and that, you know, we need to prepare for the worst. So I also think that there is, I mean, because I'm based in DC, and what I've seen is that there was a monopoly of advocacy for so long. And I think this was really the biggest, I think it was an opportunity, but I think it was beautiful to see the Iranian diaspora. I mean, the Islamic Republic, for so long, they thought that, you know, they were not interested in Iranian affairs anymore, and so they could sleep and do whatever they want. But seeing the mobilization across the world, that was I think very important. And seeing the diaspora mobilizing, I think it has policy implications. Even for the Biden administration, they've been consulting with advocates and so on. I think this was really a win. And yeah, to finish, I think this was not just the biggest accomplishment, but also many had no idea what Iranians were dealing with on a daily basis. They had no idea because there was. I wouldn't say, you know, that that people were apologizing or like playing it nice, but there were simply not many networks through which we could see how people were oppressed. So I think this the fact that it got exposed, it's a huge accomplishment by itself. Concerning the challenges, I do think that the biggest challenge is going to be the military and the security one. The Islamic Republic is making sure that it can survive and can last as long as it can, especially through weaponization. So there is a nuclear file and there's a non-nuclear file where, you know, they develop drones, kamikaze drones, that are now hitting Ukrainians. And these are, I think, the security challenges, especially with the United States position, is I think the main factor that can change the dynamics when it comes to the Islamic Republic. So yeah, I do think this is the biggest one. I advocate for maximum pressure when it comes to the Islamic Republic. I think it's really time to do so, because by refusing to tackle the challenge in the Middle East, now the challenge is also in Europe. It's killing, you know, Ukrainians. So this is how I've seen things, and how I believe, you know, the main takeaways and the main challenge.
Thank you, Zineb. You watch closely China's influence in the Middle East region. How much do you think that the regime, Iran's regime, has benefited from Chinese cooperation, Russian cooperation? How much do you think, I mean, this is, Hillel addressed this at the UN forum. How much do you think that's been important in the confidence to repress?
Yeah, so there was a huge debate. I think it was on March, where Senator Ted Cruz, he asked about all sanctions, and Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he said that the administration is really struggling to enforce sanctions, because, you know, China is really benefiting from Iranian oil exports, and it's helping the Islamic Republic regime to evade sanctions and to sustain itself. I do see, you know, China obviously benefiting from this situation. It's really through that they were able to court Riyadh and to seduce others in the region. So I do think that U.S. position on not really enforcing sanctions and not effectively stopping Iranian exports to China, it has huge implications when it comes to how China is also going to benefit from these from the lack of enforcement. And so yeah, the fact that the U.S. is not really enforcing present sanctions and not forcing China to comply, it really means that that either the Biden administration is playing the long game, which is so that they can approach Iran for a nuclear deal, or that they're just trying to integrate Iran more and more into the region. And either way, it's not good for to get rid of the Islamic Republic regime. It's not good for the region as a whole, because the Islamic Republic has ambitions. It is an expansionist type of regime. So yeah, this is how I've seen it so far.
Excellent, excellent. So good to. Every time I hear Zineb, I'm more and more proud.
Oh, thank you.
Wonderful. And our last but not least speaker is Carl Gershman. Carl is the former president of the National Endowment for Democracy, a private congressionally supported grant-making institution with the mission to strengthen democratic institutions around the world through non-governmental efforts. In addition to presiding over its grant-making throughout the world, Carl has overseen creation of the quarterly Journal of Democracy, the International Forum for Democratic Studies, the Reagan-Fassel Democracy Fellows Program, and the Center for International Media Assistance. Carl also took the lead in launching in New Delhi in 1999 the World Movement for Democracy, which is a global network of democracy practitioners and scholars. Carl has won every kind of honor and award from democratic nations from around the world and democratic movements. He has published prolifically in commentary, The New Leader, The New Republic, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, New York Times Magazine, Democratization, and on and on. As I mentioned, he needs no introduction and is really a giant in the world of democracy promotion. Carl, thank you for making time to be with us. I think we need to unmute you. I'm trying to do it.
Okay, you can hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, it's good to see all of you and to meet some of you, because I know some people from before, Hillel, but not everyone, Mariam, but not everyone. So it's great to see you. And thank you, Mariam, for pulling this discussion together, which I have found, really interesting. I found the discussion, there are no answers yet, but there are also a lot of clear and interesting questions, and we need to tackle those. It's a very complex picture. There's no question that significant gains have been made, primarily in delegitimizing the regime, for all the reasons that people have talked about. It's a weaker regime than it was before. It's a more vulnerable regime, and not just because of the protests, but because of the deep corruption of the regime, the ideological bankruptcy of the regime. It's a regime that is vulnerable. I think, Yvonne might have said nervous. It should be, because it is deeply vulnerable. At the same time, and that gets to the first question. The second question about the challenges are awesome, and the regime, the opposition, especially in the diaspora, is divided. The protests, the repression has been harsh, and the protests, for now at least, have been crushed. There needs to be a new spark, a new momentum. Yesterday we observed the 50th anniversary of the revolution the coup in Chile, which led then to a 15-year process of trying to develop an opposition. And what I think is useful to note is the sharp contrast between the situation in Chile in the 1980s from the situation in Iran today. You know, in Chile, you had a democratic opposition, which by the early 80s had really secured a kind of legitimacy in what you might call the pillars of society, the business class, the labor movement, the church, the Catholic Church. Iran has nothing of that at this stage. And the outside power, the dominant outside power in Chile in the 1980s was the United States, which played a decisive role when it came to the referendum in 1988. Whereas we know the dominant outside powers in Iran today are Russia and China, which play the exact opposite kind of a role. So we're faced with the difficulty, the impasse that everyone has referred to today. This is a vulnerable regime, yet you don't see the cracks in the regime. The repression is harsh. The allies are strong. I think that Ray Takei and Roland Marc-Garec in Foreign Affairs are wrong in speaking about the regime should feel triumphant at the present moment, but it's just a very, very difficult process that lies ahead. And it may not happen quickly. It could happen at any time. We don't know. It's going to rely upon a lot of what people talked about, defections, splits in the security apparatus, which are not apparent yet. And obviously the protest movement maintaining its ability to succeed. What as I think about this, I know there's a tremendous amount of frustration with the West, with the United States. To me, it's all symbolized by something that happened. Roya Hakakian told me about this week, where she was invited to take part in a roundtable at the Council on Foreign Relations with Raisi. The fact that the Council on Foreign Relations is having a roundtable with someone who's got the blood of thousands on his hands, and which then justifies it by saying, well, we are that kind of an organization. We've hosted a lot of controversial leaders in the past, but this is somebody with, the deaths of, of thousands on his hands, and that they have no shame in having this kind of a meeting is symbolic of the weakness of the West, which we've talked about. And frankly, I hate to say this, but I almost feel it's inevitable. It's built into the system. When the U.S. is seeking, compromises, strategic advantages, the idea of, trying to buy restraint on the nuclear front, it's just not going to work. It's feckless. So where do we look for change then? And, since you wanted something comparative, I look at a situation like Poland in the 1980s. It came from the emergence of solidarity. It came from Lech Wałęsa jumping over a fence. It came from the process of continued struggle during the 1980s after the Polish government crushed the solidarity opposition in 1981, yet it didn't disappear. And eventually it led to a process where they had enough influence to force a negotiation with the regime. Now, I don't know that that can happen in a country like Iran. I tend to doubt it. The international situation is very difficult. But I guess what I'm saying to you is that I think that the cutting edge for change is going to come from within, and it's not going to come from without. Without is going to be dragged along. But what do we have to do on the outside? And we have to have a strategy on the outside, which is also long-term, which fights the political battle. So when then something like this incident that the Council on Foreign Relations happens, we fight that. And we fight it on every front, recognizing that we have to challenge the basic ideas that inform and mobilize this Western appeasement, which is the idea that trade and dialogue somehow will do some good. We have to try to convey to the public opinion in the West as best we can the view of the opposition in Iran that this is not a government that can be reformed. It has to be removed. And that process can only take place through struggle, and then through that struggle leading to the erosion of regime confidence, splits in the regime, where then we can think very strategically about how to exploit those splits in the regime. I don't really, frankly, I'm not giving up on the West. Obviously, Hillel needs to mobilize all the support he can get for every battle at the UN, but that's on the margins, frankly. The real struggle is going to take place within, the opposition is going to need all the solidarity and support we can mobilize, and it'll occasionally come from governments, but it's basically going to have to come from intellectuals, civil society, and others that we can mobilize in the West.
Thank you, Carl. I think you're pointing to your heart, the heart emoji. I'm not sure if that's for Carl or by Carl. It was an excellent presentation. You're really focused on the inside, and I think from that global comparative aerial view perspective that you have on really every freedom movement across the globe, and particularly the contrast that you've drawn to Chile in the 1980s, it seems like what you're saying is that there needs to be political unity, convergence, solidarity, but of the kind that's of forces inside the country. Is that right?
I think that's where the impetus for change is going to come from. It always does, by the way.
Yeah.
And now, what you try to do is you try to mobilize international support. I'm just very, I think the international situation right now is not propitious. Even though I think Russia and China have their own very, very deep vulnerabilities, the crises in China, not just over the economy, but it's very severe, but over COVID. I mean, almost a delegitimation of the regime inside, the way it handled the COVID thing, such a disastrous process of the way they've handled the epidemic. And then Russia, of course, is, I don't want to call it a basket case, but if Ukraine can win, that will be a very, very significant factor in strengthening the movement in Iran. This is a global struggle that we're involved in. We have to see it as a global struggle. We can't just fight this battle or that battle. Probably the most important thing that could happen today is a Ukrainian victory in the war, and then obviously deterring China over Taiwan. And if that can happen, I think that will increase the prospects for change in Iran. But that struggle is going to have to come from within. Hopefully, possibly, even though it's very, very difficult for any kind of an organized opposition to emerge from within, these things could happen. You could have your Wałęsa. It's conceivable that you could have a Havel who emerges. I don't see it coming from the diaspora, especially after our experience, with the so-called Group of Eight since February. I mean, it's just not going to happen. It has to come from within.
Okay. Sharan, you have been immersed, particularly over the last year, in trying to forge solidarity and actions that are more unified. How's that gone? I mean, you're involved in one particular group. What are the lessons that you draw from that? Carl, your mouse may be, Sharan, you're muted. Sharan Jen, you're muted.
Sorry, I know,
Okay.
I unmuted myself. I'm very sorry to hear what Carl has said. I think that my all hope is that there will be a proper fundamental change. Any change from inside Iran, if it's going to be a fundamental change, if it's going to be something that would be a reward of those who put their life in their hands and are doing that, it will be brutally suppressed as it has been suppressed. So people inside Iran who can come up and advocate what people want, people who are in the streets and are coming in the streets want, they're going to be suppressed immediately so badly. They want the outside world, excuse me, to take the initiative and do something about it, because any voice that is the real voice of people in Iran will be immediately silenced. But there are compromises, and people in Iran have said that they don't want compromises. Recently, I've said that over and over. Recently, the Islamic Republic called some of the prominent Iranian people, Iranian dissidents, from prison or outside prison, and told them that if they try to damage the Prince Reza, they will leave their hands open to say what they want, to do interviews and to promote their cause, their way of Republican ideas. But this is, in my view, and in many views, another reformism in disguise. And it will not, under this regime, no compromise, no middle way, no change will ever happen. This is what the ultra left is saying. They're saying that if you take away the velayat faqih, the top, the Khamenei, and that's why you hear everything is targeted towards Khamenei, because everybody agree on that. Even the Revolutionary Guards agree with that the removal, at least giving the slogan that Khamenei is the absolute villain, and that everyone agrees on it. But that is not the solution. The solution is a fundamental change. That's what people want, and any other solution will be defeated by people, and it would not.
Well, there's no disagreement there. There's no disagreement there. Carl is saying that people want fundamental change. He's saying that it will only come from the inside, because
I'm saying it won't come from inside, because any movement, any person who wants a fundamental change will be silenced immediately, will be killed, will be tortured, will be silenced. They won't let it happen. There were hopes on that, but it won't happen. It will not happen.
Sharan, is it possible that there be a movement that is not so much focused on leaders and leadership, but that is successful, because we've already seen over the last year how much Iranians are willing to come out on the streets and to strike. If there is a more strategic direction for the movement from inside the country,
strategic movement from inside, how could it happen? A strategic movement needs organization, needs making people to know what to do.
Okay, let's bring in Ivan Marovic, because this is his experience. Strategic organization from the inside.
Yeah, before I go into the before I go into the strategic level of organizing, let me just kind of offer two external things that are going to influence that. First one is the overall political climate in the world. So, as you know, we've been in the third wave of democratic decline for 2 decades now. So in a sense, the third wave of democracy that started in the 70s. By the time the struggle against Pinochet culminated in the late 80s that Carl was talking about, before that, people weren't even sure that the third wave of democracy was going on, because it starts slowly and then it builds up. So it started building up in the 80s. The wave of autocratization started already in the late 90s, according to VDEM, and according to some others, it started in the early 2000s. But anyhow, it accelerated in the last 10 years. So now it's obvious. People now see that the wave of autocratization is underway, and the autocrats are feeling so emboldened that, you know, the war in Ukraine is a good example of that. But we may see the apex of that wave, and hopefully the fourth wave of democratization will start. So this is important because the overall global or geopolitical climate is important for internal developments. If we, as we hope, enter the new wave of democracy, if the main autocratic countries like China and Russia are, how shall I say, start playing defense in the years to come, that is going to be a fertile ground. The second thing is technological aspect. That means that the technology, the information technology, especially communication and information technology, that was seen by many authors as liberation technology, as Larry Diamond called it in the 20 years ago, was captured by the autocrats. So everything that we see, from divisive rhetoric on social media to disinformation to spying, surveillance, and everything else that is happening online, is a result of that capture of digital technology by social media. That is changing as well.
We might have a disruptor in our Skype call from yeah, I think Carl's account has been hacked, which is not surprising. But I guess we will go on. So sorry. So the chat is not from Carl. Carl isn't typing anything, I don't think. And I've noticed some other things that give me the impression that Carl's account is being used by a hacker. And I think I know why. So go ahead. I think that Ivan's points in response to Sharan's, and Ivan, feel free to continue. But I think you're making the point that we have to take the larger global situation that Iran's movement is finding itself in, and not necessarily attribute all the weaknesses or the challenges to the forces of the opposition inside the country. Is that right?
Exactly. So the overall political climate and technological basis for organizing is very unfavorable to organizing social movements at the moment. But also it is reaching an apex. So the authoritarian countries such as Russia and China have are in the middle of an overreach, and some of the things that were mentioned by Carl earlier in terms of how China was dealing with internally, but also externally. Their charm offensive isn't as working as it used to 5 or 10 years ago. Russia again is how shall I say, stuck in something that they thought is going to last for 3 days in Ukraine, but it turned out that Ukrainians are much tougher nut to crack for Russia. And so we can see that there is a potential for this tide to change. On the technological front, the problem of movements was that they used information and communication technology that can be used for two things: for internal communication of the movement and for external communication, meaning to kind of spread your message. That now is understood that there are limitations there, and some of those limitations were pointed out by Morozov in his book Net Delusion long time ago, but now they're obvious to everyone. So re-strategizing regarding the use of technology in organizing and in communication, internal and external, will actually take us out of the current predicament. And the movements, as they are finding better ways to do this and to address these limitations and obstacles, whether it is surveillance, whether it is disinformation, whether it is digital disruption, they will emerge more efficient. So in a sense, it is all about understanding the current situation and adjusting your strategies towards it. The similar thing was happening in the previous waves of democracy, although the technological level was different, and it was, how should I say, in the 80s, if you lived in Eastern Europe, the whole thing was like, how can you organize an underground printing house without being caught? And today it is how you organize online but avoid being infiltrated, being subject to disinformation, and being subject to these influence operations that these authoritarian regimes are conducting.
Mariam, can I just say one thing, please?
Sure.
In 2009, I was working at the Radio Free Europe when that uprising happened, and Iranians were told were the first nation who managed the social media in best way to communicate. And I wrote a lot about that and gave a talk about that at London University. But since then, I mean, the government, with the help of Russian and Chinese, have acquired, systems that they can, I mean, more than anything that you can imagine, they check people. They follow their every single move. They find them whatever they want to do, and they're on top of this. And how we can devise a strategy? I wish I knew. Not that me. I mean, I'm not no one in when it comes to technology, but I wish that these young, savvy people of Iran could find a way. They tried, but they can't. They tell us that they cannot use the social media in an effective way to take forward their movement. So what can we do in this situation? What can we do? Can we ask Elon Musk to give us some devices, some new things to confront it? I don't know. I haven't heard any solution to that. And I agree with you that that is today's way of communication. That is today's way of organizing. But it doesn't work. They don't let them to use it. They are far more advanced than them, and they constantly curtail their whatever they have.
Hillel, do you have comments? Because you've also seen many movements around the world. It's certainly, pushback and crackdown is definitely not a new thing. But I think that we will close after one round of comments from everybody, not least because of Carl's account being compromised.
Yeah, could you be more precise? What are you asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking what you think about that. With the current climate, particularly online, how difficult it is to have a truthful narrative, to bridge differences and build unity when the regime cyber army is so effective, and when inside the country the crackdown is so deep. I guess Sharan is saying that inside it's impossible to organize. And Ivan is saying, and Carl is saying that is the challenge to be overcome, because the outside isn't necessarily creating the kind of the kind of opportunities that are necessary if they're going to lead. But even if they were going to lead, I would add that the political leadership outside the country recognizes that their efforts only go so far, Sharan. I mean, unless the inside does what it needs to do. So I guess Hillel, with your perspective from other democracy movements around the world, where do you see the focus that Iran's movement needs to have right now?
Yeah, look, it's I would say the common thing that I can see for other movements is indeed how hard it is to confront regimes. You know, that's the default. We talked about Poland, and you know, we've come up with other examples, whether it's, I don't know, South Africa or Czech Republic or what have you. But we talked about Chile. But these had their particular moments, and they are the exceptions. You know, we're working with Cubans and Venezuelans, and it's hard. You know, Cubans, the regime has been there for more than 6 decades, and the regime is strong. And you go around to others. If you want to talk about China, if you want to talk about Russia, and others, the regimes are very strong. So it certainly it doesn't surprise me how difficult it is for the Iranian movement. Obviously, last year we were more hopeful. They did seem to have momentum on their side, I do think that we are in a moment. The regime felt it, that you did have a mass movement that they never had before, and there was that element, at least last year, where the fear seemed to go away. And I guess still in Iran today, it seems that there are some women who are not wearing the hijab anymore. So there still seems to be a potential moment, I would say, for the movement inside Iran. But obviously the regime is still strong, and I'm concerned about what the West is doing to give them more legitimacy and to give them more encouragement. And it seems that's what they're getting these days with the release of the billions and the other sorts of appeasement.
Okay, maybe last comments from Ivan, Zineb, Sharan, and then we'll close. Zineb, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I just wanted also to point out how the region is changing. The Middle East is changing. I mean, the changes that are happening in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Kuwait, in Bahrain, all of these countries, they are normalizing with Israel. They are trying to get new infrastructure for their young population. They are very focused on a future that integrates women, girls, you know, and all of their youth. They are looking ahead, and they are looking at the future. And I think Iranians are seeing that. That they have a rich country with a human capital that is amazing. That they are well educated, but they don't benefit like their neighbors. And so I do think that the dynamics in the region will definitely impact the future of the movement. It's becoming clear, especially since the usage of social media, and how some Iranians were comparing, you know, how life in Saudi Arabia is compared to their own lives in Iran. I do think that this is something to watch very closely. So I think, yeah, there's the environment that is changing. I do think also that we are moving from, I mean, slowly. It will take a lot of time, obviously, because the status quo of the Iran policy was appeasement, trying to appease the regime, try to deal with it, give whatever you can, just so that they don't bully you. You know, this type of policy is just not working. At some point, I think the European Union is also changing. That there is a shift in how they are tackling this. They're not doing as much as we would love them to do, but just the fact that that we are witnessing this change, it means that that it's moving towards a good direction. Although one last point is that Iran is playing a big role now in the Ukraine in Russia's war against Ukrainians, and I do think it will at some point have drastic effects on the Islamic Republic as a regime. So yeah, I do see that these are the next steps, and maybe things that can change the dynamics.
But if I may say something, I mean, from all this talk and what goes on, I mean, not only your views, but I hear all that all the time. I mean, the Iranian people hear that, and they constantly in their slogans and in their chantings, they say we only have ourselves. The free world has given up on us. I'm sorry, I want you to know this, the view of Iranian inside Iran, not outside only. They say we don't have anybody on our side. We're alone and we'll get our country back. They say when and how many lives have to be, young lives have to be lost, I don't know, but this is their resolve, and they think that they're not giving up. On the fact that Middle East is changing, I'm very pleased with that. I hope that Iran's revolution had a good impact on women movement in the entire Middle East, and they come to understand that political Islam is not a solution. And I see that more and more in Iraq, in other countries, and especially in Morocco from a long time ago. Your country's king has changed direction and took a very inclusive way to deal with the political dissent, and that was very, very good, and that was as a result of what happened to Iran. But anyway, what I'm saying is that I understand the international climate about Iran, and I understand that the Middle East is gaining a lot because of that. But we hope that one day the Iranian people prove that they can take back their country. Thank you.
But the Middle East as a whole doesn't gain from having this regime in power. I mean, I have to disagree with you, Sharan. I mean, this is a regime that has victimized, brutalized really every country in the region, and anyone who is thinking strategically and morally about the future of their country in the region wants this regime gone. But maybe last words from Hillel, and then Ivan, if you have any last words from you, and then we'll close. Go ahead, Hillel.
Yes. Look, as we approach the anniversary, I just want to salute the brave women and men of Iran for their incredible courage to stand up to this regime, and so many of the activists like you, Mariam, and others that I've had a privilege to work with, especially over the past year. It's been a very powerful moment, and we're committed to fighting it here at the UN. Iran will be given the gavel at this Human Rights Council Social Forum. We'll be fighting it and exposing it. And as Carl said, we need to fight these, shameful attitudes, whether it's the Council of Foreign Relations or the UN legitimizing this regime, and we're not going to give up.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for everything that you're doing, Hillel. Last words from Ivan.
Thank you, Mariam, and just again to join Hillel in this admiration of the bravery and what the Iranian people have accomplished in the last year, and again to go back to the perspective of like how this movement is more diverse, more decentralized, and more broad-based than any other movement in the past, and also to kind of connect that to this moment in world history where the tide is turning against authoritarianism, and hopefully the climate will be more conducive to more successful pro-democracy movements, not just in Iran, but in many other countries that really need pro-democracy movements, and also to stress that, you know, what the challenges lying ahead and how they can be resolved are in building the joint vision and unity around the alternative that can actually help those sitting on the fence, still, how should I say, weighing their options to push them towards defection, because the regime that cannot keep their supporters around is not going to be able to sustain much longer. So that is kind of my final comment, let's say.
Okay, thank you so much. I apologize for the interruptions and disruptions. Carl Gershman's account has been hacked, but I'm gonna address that. I know what happened. Thank you very much for making time to join us. I hope that we can have more conversations like this so that we can benefit from your comparative perspectives, from all the hard work that you've been doing to help Iranians, particularly Ivan, and so many years, Hillel, so many years, really reaching out to activists and providing them with platforms and learning opportunities. Again, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who has been watching this program.
Thank you.
Thank you.